Hello and Happy New Year. Welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 4th of January. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, Owen Matthews writes this week's cover piece on Vladimir Putin's so-called peace plan for Ukraine. He'll be on the show with Mark Galeotti to discuss whether a ceasefire is really possible and under what terms it might be negotiated. Sticking with foreign affairs, I'll speak to Arash Azizi about whether direct conflict between Iran and Israel is looming, and Lionel Shriver about which is a bigger threat to American democracy this year, the political left or the political right. Back in the UK, what troubles does Rishi Sunak have ahead of him this month? I'll speak to James Heale. Was Churchill really a progressive? Sinclair McKay will join me. And lastly, do box tickers now rule the office? I'll speak to Rory Sutherland. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. First up, Owen Matthews writes this week's cover piece about how Vladimir Putin hopes to partition Ukraine. President Zelensky, Owen writes, could be pressured into negotiating a ceasefire soon. Owen joins me on the show now, alongside Spectator contributor Mark Galeotti. Owen and Mark, thanks for joining Spectator TV. Owen, you write the cover piece for this week's magazine about the possibility of a so-called peace deal in Ukraine. Tell us about recent reports that suggest that something could be in the works.
Well, first and foremost, let's be very clear. We're not talking about a peace deal. We're talking about a ceasefire. And those are actually two very really important things. I think a ceasefire is something that Putin has reportedly, and I know personally the reporters that worked on this for the New York Times who reported it on the 23rd of December, and they have very good sources. And their information is that there have been unofficial back-channel feelers from the Kremlin to senior officials in Washington to discuss the possibility of a ceasefire, not necessarily a peace deal, but a ceasefire, essentially freezing the conflict along the line of control. And I find that pretty plausible, actually, because that kind of deal, that kind of arrangement, that kind of ceasefire allows Putin to sort of lock in a situation on the ground that he hopes is going to become a sort of de facto eventual partition of Ukraine. But the point of my piece this week is that although Putin putting out peace feelers or wanting to talk is not necessarily news, what's really news is that I think what US policymakers are starting to realize is that one essential ingredient of any kind of eventual ceasefire or post-war arrangement or end game or wherever you like to call it is essentially dividing Ukraine and allowing Putin to keep the part that he's already occupied. And that comes with enormous moral hazard and practical problems.
Mark, do you agree with Owen's characterization of Putin's thinking? After the Christmas assault on Ukraine, can we take these calls seriously?
We can, because it's for entirely pragmatic reasons. Look, on the one hand, Putin clearly has a wider goal of actually wanting to essentially subordinate Ukraine, remove it from being part of, as he sees it, the West's sphere of influence and bring it back into his. But essentially, Putin is also deeply pragmatic. He's aware that this is an exceedingly expensive, politically and economically, war for himself. And although this coming year is unfortunately looking quite good for the Russians, they have an advantage in terms of ammunition. The Ukrainians are probably going to have to spend the year essentially rebuilding after their rather unsuccessful counteroffensive and so forth. Once you start getting into 2025 and beyond, there's actually some real risks for the Russians. So I can see Putin thinking, well, this is a good time precisely to regard this as in some ways a high watermark of Russian occupation. Let's try and freeze it now through the medium of a ceasefire. If things change dramatically, then I can always break the ceasefire. It's not as though Putin regards himself as being sort of bound by these kind of agreements. But on the other hand, it also poses a great dilemma for the West. Because, let's be perfectly honest, not only are there many countries in the West that would frankly rather not be spending what it costs to support Ukraine, but also, particularly in Washington, there is a growing almost terror of what might happen were Donald Trump to win the presidency. And certainly for some people within the blob, I mean, I'm encountering it in my own conversations with officials there, is that sense of we can't let this war roll on until it becomes Donald Trump's playground. We actually have to reach some kind of a settlement before that point, which makes them really quite vulnerable to this kind of suasion from Moscow.
Oh, and I want to pull up the cover image here because I think it makes the point really well that when we talk about a peace deal, some kind of deal, a ceasefire, these words don't necessarily reflect reality. It has been a big talking point from the beginning of this conflict that agreeing to some sort of peace deal would legitimize Putin's terror and what he's done. But there's also a bigger question for Ukrainians about whether or not it just gives him more time to regroup and come back even stronger. When we talk about all of these options, whatever name we put on them, are we really talking about a safer world, particularly for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, as Mark completely correctly has said and has argued for many years, the key feature of the Putin regime has always been this absolutely ruthless pragmatism and the fact that they constantly adapt to situations. And it's very hard to actually read any kind of grand strategy. Or let me put it differently. I mean, although a grand strategy may exist, there in the Kremlin, in Putin's mind, there are usually several such grand strategies running in parallel, and actually they just sort of chop and change between them all the time. We've seen that time and time again, over Georgia, over Syria, over Crimea, and so on. They basically, Putin will take whatever he can get. The problem is, the really fundamental difficulty is that a forever war does not favor Ukraine. So currently there's a major disconnect between the official position of Zelensky and his inner team, which is that we need to fight on till the end. We need to persuade the West to give the weapons that we need to fight the war, although in parentheses, it's not really clear, having had the weapons that they have, what further escalation is going to be required to actually achieve the goal of returning 1991 borders. I mean, that's a lot of equipment. But there's a fundamental disconnect between that Zelensky position that we need to keep fighting until Russia is defeated and the actual future of Ukraine, because actually, although the war, as Marcus said, is expensive, for Russia, it's still building up its military capabilities. It's getting stronger, I would say, not weaker, over time. And meanwhile, Ukraine is losing its main asset, tragically, which is its people. And Ukraine faces a terrible shortage of men to recruit for the front lines, and we already see some fractures appearing in Ukrainian society. So in a nutshell, you have a contradiction and a problem, because actually a long, endless war does not favor Ukraine. It probably favors Russia. And at the same time, the longer the war goes on, the longer Ukraine has to wait to actually reconstruct itself, reform itself, and sail off into its bright European future. None of that can happen until a ceasefire happens or until the conflict is somehow resolved.
Mark, what do you make of those comments that a longer war is more difficult for Ukraine? How likely is it that Ukraine could win back some of that remaining land? And do you think the Ukrainian people are ready to accept some kind of deal that doesn't include all of that land being returned?
When asked the straightforward up and down question of should we fight on until we have achieved victory, victory being defined in terms of regaining all the occupied territories, a very clear majority of Ukrainians still say yes. But in some ways that's misleading, because that is, if nothing else, an appeal to patriotism. People know what the quote-unquote right answer is. What's interesting is I know there's been focus group work trying to talk to Ukrainians about particular objectives and essentially what would you think is an acceptable cost in terms of lives. And Owen is absolutely right. I mean, although the Russians have lost a lot more men, proportionate to population, Ukraine is suffering greater than the Russians. So, what do you think needs to be spent? And, when we look at, for example, Crimea, a lot of Ukrainians, frankly, are probably not thinking that it's worth the likely cost of regaining this peninsula, many of whose inhabitants, especially now that there have been about 1 million Russian colonists arriving, currently, many of whose inhabitants, therefore, actually want to be Russian rather than Ukrainian. I remember once talking to a Ukrainian interior minister official, fairly senior, who was concerned that basically he said Crimea could be our Northern Ireland. So, I mean, for all these reasons, one has to go beyond that overall sort of current determination to regain all the territory. I think that certainly in the West, but also amongst quite a few figures within Kiev, there is a quiet awareness that someday some deal will be struck. The problems are two. One is no one wants to say so publicly for fear of being pilloried, especially so long as Zelensky himself is so fervently committed to a full maximalist kind of victory. But the second thing is, in some ways, no one wants to show their hand before any negotiations. The sense being, if you more or less admit that you, for example, might not want Crimea, then in a way the Russians would take as read, well, we've got Crimea, what else can we get? So this is the trouble. At the moment, in a way, it is waiting for someone to be the first person to make that kind of move. Putin thinks time is on his side, so he's not willing to do it. Zelensky also thinks, I think, time is on his side. So for that reason, neither of the leaders really at this moment are willing to make those kind of tough, self-abnegating choices which negotiations will involve.
Owen, Mark just mentioned President Zelensky. What are his positions publicly, but perhaps more importantly, privately, on this issue of a deal?
Well, as far as I understand it, his private position is pretty much the same as his public position, is that they realize that there's a fatal cascade that begins in your war effort if you start to decide that you are talking. And once you announce that, you actually immediately basically pull the carpet in terms of morale and in terms of, no one wants to be, famously John Kerry said, no one wants to be the last man to die for a mistake. And that's the colossal problem for Zelensky in admitting any kind of negotiation. Furthermore, by the way, last October, Zelensky actually wrote into law that negotiations with the Putin regime was literally illegal. So he literally is not able to do that until he changes his own law. I mean, it's a kind of strange kind of thing to write into law, but nonetheless, Zelensky did it to signal his resolve, not one step back. But at the same time, you see growing discontent, or not discontent, but certainly like the return of politics, let's put it like that, in Kiev. And by a gigantic irony, the only thing that is actually keeping Zelensky, the main thing is keeping Zelensky popular and keeping Ukraine united is Putin's appalling attacks. Absent the Christmas and New Year bombardment, which has been among the heaviest of the war, you would actually see very rather serious fissures and debates developing in Ukrainian society. And I just spent 3 weeks in Kiev, and I spoke to lots of people for current and former Zelensky senior ministers and advisors. And those who'd oppose him or who would, under normal circumstances, speak out, prefer not to, because it's пока не время. It's not the time to do it now that we're under attack. But there is actually a growing groundswell of opinion that Zelensky actually has mismanaged the war, and not that we should surrender, put up our hands and hand over the territories, but certainly there's some kind of compromise has to be reached with the Russians. And if you look, as Mark rightly said, the Ukrainian people's opinion, it all depends very much on the question you ask. Because if you ask a slightly different question, and it was asked at the beginning of December, do you think that some kind of compromise is necessary to end this war? Then 43% of Ukrainians surveyed by well-respected Kiev pollster said yes, and 46% no. So, clearly there's a very large minority of Ukrainians that are actually kind of willing to, not only willing to do a deal, but willing to publicly admit that a deal needs to be done.
Mark, last question. In his New Year's address, Putin didn't really mention his war in Ukraine. It seems like he wants to distract or even move on from the conflict when it comes to those kinds of public speeches. If there were some kind of a deal, we can pretty much assume that regardless of what it looked like, money would be pouring into Ukraine from the West immediately to help it rebuild. We cannot say the same about the West's reaction to Russia. Would Putin be allowed to return to activity as usual, even if a peace deal were secured?
Well, look, there's no question that we'd return to some kind of status quo ante, even if there was some kind of, not just a ceasefire, but an actual peace deal. Probably we would see some kind of sanctions relief as a necessary part of that deal. But even so, I mean, essentially we're entering in a future in which, at least as long as Putin is in the Kremlin, there will be continued controls over the export of technology, over investment into Russia and so forth. I mean, we are heading back into a Cold War era in that respect. So, again, it won't just simply be a sort of kumbaya moment where we all just sort of pretend that this ghastly war never happened. But that said, I think from Putin's point of view, he is in a position in which actually he is constrained, I think, more by his own sense of his historic destiny, his place in sort of basically the pantheon of Russian state-building heroes, rather than pressure from below. It is not actually as if most Russians are sitting there saying, go back to the example that Owen gave, that so Avdiivka must be ours. They don't want to lose, but but not wanting to be defeated is different from actually having some kind of clear objectives. If Putin were able to negotiate something that looked like a peace, and that looked like a peace from his point of view with honor, and remember, he controls the media, so he has considerable freedom to spin whatever happens as some kind of honorable success. If he can do that, then I think the Russian people will be quite accepting of that. But as I say, I think Putin himself in this respect is the constraint. He will know that it won't really be a victory. And I think he may well not feel that is either politically survivable for him or the legacy that he wants to go down in history for.
Owen and Mark, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. It appears Israel was behind the assassination of a senior Hamas figure in Lebanon earlier this week. Is the attack a sign that direct conflict between Israel and Iran is getting closer? I'm joined now by Arash Azizi, author of What Iranians Want. Arash, thank you for joining Spectator TV. The deputy political leader of Hamas, Salah al-Aruri, was killed in Lebanon earlier this week. It looks like an Israeli airstrike. What was your reaction?
It's clear that Israel was going to take serious revenge on Hamas leadership and kill people responsible. Of course, their most sort of the target they really want most is Mohammed Deif, who was in Gaza and is very likely to have been the mastermind of the October 7th terrorist attacks. But Salah Aruri is also a very high-ranking figure. Importantly, Aruri had a very important role in linking Hamas to the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Iranian regime, and the IRGC, the militia that rules things in Iran. And we have to remember the Iranian regime is the only serious state in the region that supports Hamas and its, sort of militarily. So killing Aruri was clearly a sort of target for Israelis. It's also, though, the fact that they killed him by a strike in Lebanese territory, in Beirut, which sort of does escalate and does increase the risk of a broader conflagration and bringing in Lebanon to this even further.
Well, yes, analysts and politicians have been warning since the start of this war that Israel could end up in an all-out war with Lebanon and Hezbollah. This is obviously an attack on a Hamas figure, but it was inside of Lebanon. Is this the beginning of an escalation?
Well, there's always a risk of an escalation, but if I was to guess, I would say that there are some positive signs that we won't have really a broader conflagration. And the basic reason for that is that neither Israel nor Iran, in the leadership of neither of these countries, want such a conflagration. So sort of like a serious regional war that would involve them directly against each other, because that could be truly destructive on really massive scale. Of course, the scale of destruction in Gaza for the people of Gaza is already as massive as it could be for the people of Gaza, but this could open up to the lives of tens of millions of people in the region, and could be really destructive and dangerous for the Iranian regime and for Israel itself. So I think the danger is always there, and one has to work against that. Things are escalated. Again, there was this terror attack in Iran today. It's not clear who did it, but it's one of the deadliest terror attacks in Iranian history. More than 100 people were killed, which really will escalate things. I think it's most likely caused by sort of a terror group like ISIS. But at any rate, what it will do is will escalate the tensions. And there is always the possibility of a broader conflagration. But certainly killing Rory hasn't gotten us there yet, and it won't do so very easily.
In this attack in Iran, it's estimated that more than 70 people have been killed. It was at commemoration for Qasem Soleimani. Can you remind our viewers who Soleimani is? And tell us more of what you make of the news, particularly in relation to Israel's relationship with Iran and potential escalation there.
Soleimani was the head of the external wings of the IRGC, this militia that really rules things in Iran these days. He was the mastermind of Iran's alliance and support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also by Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, a group that forms the government in parts of Yemen and has been sort of firing rockets in Israel and at other sort of ships going on the Red Sea. Soleimani was a linchpin of Iran's relationship with the Syrian government of Bashar Assad, and he had actually a very important role by bringing Putin's and Russian intervention there. So he was really this grand figure and a high-ranking figure who was killed on January 3rd, 2020 by a U.S. strike. Now, the January 3rd is usually a very tense day. In the 4th anniversary, as I said, we've seen this grand terror attack. Look, it's very early on, but I can say by my own estimation, if you ask me right now, it is a speculation, it's a bit of an informed guess, but I would think the most likely culprit is a group like ISIS Khorasan, for example, the group's regional branch in Afghanistan, or a similar domestic or a sort of foreign terror group. Now, it's not impossible that Israel could have been involved, but there is no, so far, there is no indication of Israel involvement. And also none of the leading Iranian officials, like the interior minister, Ahmad Vahidi, or the head of the judiciary, those who have spoken, none of them have pointed fingers at Israel yet. And there is also some analysts say that even if this, the Iranian regime would be very careful at doing so, because of course then if it points fingers at Israel, that means that it would have to retaliate, which as I said, is something that it doesn't want to necessarily do. The Iranian regimes and the leadership of Ali Khamenei, its supreme leader, has brought a lot of instability to this region, but he's also been very careful to save his own skin and that of his regime by not getting Iran into a broader war. So that's likely the kind of decision-making we're going to see from him in the days to come, which is not so dissimilar to decision-making by Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, who also is not actually sort of a guy who sort of wants to get his country into a very broad war usually, even though he now finds himself in a deadly conflict with Hamas in Gaza. But because of what we know about Khamenei, Netanyahu, and not to mention Biden in the United States, which would be critical in any decision-making on parts of Israel, none of these figures would like a broader conflagration, and that's something that militates against it. Although, of course, conflicts happen all the time, even though when none of the sides really want it. So the danger is there.
We've also seen the Houthis, a rebel group in Yemen, backed by Iran, causing havoc in the Red Sea, targeting merchant ships. Iran, the US, and the UK have all deployed battleships to the area. Are all of these incidents part of the same proxy story?
They are and they aren't. They are in the sense that the axis of resistance, this umbrella of groups that is backed by IRGC group in Iran. There's ideological unity in it. They are anti-Western, they're anti-Israeli, and they have these commonalities. They have similar heroes. And Iran has really tried. IRGC, the Iranian regime, have tried in the past couple of decades to really build them up, bring them up closer, make them more military sophisticated. If you look at the history of the Houthis, there used to be a mostly tribal-based insurgency in Yemen, in northern Yemen, and really made things a part of the architecture of that country. But the IRGC officials, as I've outlined in my work before, really tried to make them into what they considered a proper ideological revolutionary group. They made their sort of, the Houthis had still on the flag of the Houthis, it says, death to Israel, death to America, but it also says damn the Jews, which really shows they had sort of a very unsophisticated anti-Semitism. Then the Iranian regime has tried to make it into a more ideological, I mean, of course, it's still anti-Semitic, but also an ideological, what they consider a revolutionary Islamist vision. So they are a part of a same theater of operations, and they do make sense all as part of this Tehran-backed axis of resistance. But at the same time, there is not a central command, sort of headquarters where they make decisions. For example, now we believe that Israeli intelligence itself believes, as Arash Azizi recently wrote in an article in the Spectator, Israeli intelligence believes that the Iranian leadership did not know about the Hamas attacks of October 7th before they occurred. So this really shows you that there is a considerable degree of autonomy that each of these groups can have, and they don't run their every single decision by Tehran and by Khamenei. And when we look at the meetings that the Iranian officials usually have with Houthi leadership or other groups, we can sometimes see that if you read beyond the statements, which they say, oh, we pledge full support, do whatever you want, we can see that there's sometimes actually a bit of a wrist slapping because, unlike these terror groups, Iran is a major state in the region, is worried about getting itself into what would be a suicidal and deadly direct conflict with Israel.
You mentioned the Anshel Pfeffer piece in this week's magazine where he writes that Iran is losing hold of its proxies. At the end of last month, he writes, the Revolutionary Guard spokesman said that Hamas's 7th of October attack was a retaliation for the death of Soleimani. And Hamas pushed back and said no, it wasn't. Is it normal to see Hamas push back on Iran in that kind of way?
As I have written before for the Spectator, also Iran and Hamas has had a shifty relationship. There has been times when they directly clashed, but in this case, so Hamas criticized the IRGC spokesperson, but that meant that he had to make a very humiliating sort of retreat himself. So Sharif, the spokesperson of IRGC, and the leadership of the IRGC, Salami, who's the main commander of the IRGC, basically they said he had misspoke. This was not an attack to revenge Soleimani. The revenge will do it differently, which was really humiliating on the part of the IRGC. But it also further, really what we've seen since October 7th to now, is that the Iranian regime plays a game. At first, it really praises Hamas for its attacks. It gives full political support to the attack. The entire Iranian TV for months now has been about the war in Gaza and full support for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. At the same time, they go out of their way to say the Palestinian theater is separate. Iran was not directly involved. This is, and they sort of use terms like saying, oh, this is Palestinian ingenuity. They're doing it by themselves. We're just supporting it. Because, as I said, every sign indicates that Ali Khamenei, the leadership of the Islamic Republic, does not want to see a direct conflict with Israel for the basic reason that, I think it's quite clear that any sort of a direct confrontation can really be suicidal for the regime, and of course terrible. And to be clear, terrible in terms of consequences for the peoples of this region. It would open a Pandora box with really unpredictable consequences, and it's something that should be avoided at all costs.
Arash, thank you so much for joining me. Lionel Shriver writes for her column in this week's magazine about how the political left and right in America will react if their candidate loses this year's election. Is violence on American streets a possibility either way? Lionel joins me now. Lionel, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You write for your column this week about a political conversation that you had with your expat guests over Christmas. Tell us about it.
Well, we were trying to decide what would be worse on the ground if Trump wins or Biden wins in November. Who would be the sorest losers? And the company I was sharing was typically, for most of the people I know, liberal, universally Democrats. And they were convinced that what we should really fear is the reaction of the right if Trump loses again. That these are the people who have all the guns, and there's that horrible precedent of January 6th, and so we'll be it would we'll be better off with Biden as president, but we would have to pay for it with a horrible backlash on the right. And of course, Democrats are always claiming that democracy itself, the republic itself, is in danger. I differed. I was the only person who thought that if Trump wins, not only are we stuck with Trump, but the left would be likely to go bananas. And I've been through this rehearsal before because, of course, we faced the same situation in 2020, right? So one of the reasons I was relieved when Biden won was not only that I had voted for him, but I so dreaded the response of the left if Trump prevailed.
Well, Lionel, let's look at your column and the two possibilities that you and your friends broadly discuss. Your friends are talking about the disgruntled Trump voters, how if they lose again, they'll feel the election was stolen again, and you could see some kind of repeat of January 6th, an attempted insurrection that could be even more violent. You point out that in the aftermath of George Floyd, you had, albeit a minority, but certainly some protesters who turned very violent and in places like Seattle and Portland, Oregon, essentially took over parts of the city in a very violent manner. And the point here being that in either direction, you could see something really quite scary. I suppose the meaningful difference, though, is that Trump was the first president to essentially say that he would not accept the results of the election. The Republicans were tested in 2020 and Donald Trump and his supporters failed. Biden has not been tested in that way. The Democrats haven't been tested at the presidential level in that way.
Well, we don't have the evidence on the left because the left has not been tested in this circumstance. I mean, the one bit of evidence we do have is from 2016, and there was a concerted 4-year effort to effectively deny Trump the presidency and to invalidate his election, which the Democrats don't like to remember because they are fixated on Trump's insistence on invalidating 2020. But there is a strong symmetry there. On the left versus right, January 6th, I found it very disturbing. It was a horrific picture to broadcast all over the world of the U.S. Capitol being invaded by a mob. And so I don't play it down exactly, except that I have striven mightily to maintain a sense of proportion about it. I don't think it was an attempt to overthrow the government of the United States. It was not well organized. It was unarmed. I don't think there was any expectation in that crowd that they would actually be able to get into the Capitol. They all, on the CCTV footage, they all look kind of amazed and baffled and wondrous, and they're taking selfies. And this is not an army which is out to overthrow any government. And if you look at the consequences were mostly for the Democrats being able to use that event politically as a cudgel. And of course, the people that they were able to get hold of were prosecuted, I think, quite disproportionately. But in comparison, the riots after George Floyd's death were all over the country, over 140 cities. There was fantastic damage done, massive arson and vandalism. And it went on for months. So, I mean, and as you noted, the cities like Seattle and Portland have never been the same. And for the most part, these riots were allowed to go nuts. The law enforcement, because it was under attack ideologically, because this was the defund the police period, laid back in a lot of metropolitan areas and just let it happen. And for the most part, the people who caused all that destruction have not been held to account either. So why wouldn't they do it again? So if I'm looking at November, then that's what makes me most nervous.
Lionel, you and I have not been always painted in a nice light over the past 3.5 years for our open and public decision to support Joe Biden in November 2020. And you and I have spoken about this when we've seen each other in person here at the Spectator offices, that people will often say to us, oh gosh, you must regret that. If you could go back to election day, surely you would recast your vote for another person. And I think both of us resoundingly say, no, I wouldn't. And with the information we had, and certainly with hindsight, with what came on January 6th, I do not regret that vote at all. I would love to know your thoughts on that, if you have any regrets. What I will say though is Joe Biden sold himself on this idea that we might return to some sanity, that we might return to some normality, not in terms of any particular piece of public policy, just in the way that we carry our conversations and political debate. It seems like we're in a worse spot now, perhaps, than we were in November 2020. And I think that goes back to the point you were making at the start about how on earth we're being asked to choose between these two directions, perspectives, and men again.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you that I wouldn't take my vote back in 2020. That said, I feel that I've been victimized by a bait and switch, and that everything that Biden promised he has gone back on. He's been anything but a unifier. All that screaming about MAGA Republicans, and he's increased the polarization, and he's certainly sold out to the far left of his party. And I have not been happy with his policies. He's been all of his appointments from day one were completely controlled by identity politics, so that all that mattered about his cabinet or his staff were whether they were gay or indigenous or black. And it was advertised as much. They were never sold in terms of their qualifications. So that made me a little concerned from the outset. And he spent too much money. I'm deeply disappointed in Biden. So I don't want people to misunderstand me that, oh, yay, go Biden.
Lionel, nothing you've said has come across as, oh, yay, go
No.
Biden.
But I have to admit that coming up on the election, I always vote, even if I'm out of the country. I make sure to get an absentee ballot. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know whom I'm going to vote for. I cannot imagine voting for either one of them. And I can see myself choosing some third party who doesn't have a chance, which is a kind of cheating. It's dodging your responsibility. If you vote for a third party, and you are usually in the context of American politics, you are usually tacitly supporting one or the other candidates who has a prayer, right? So
I'd cautiously encourage it, of course, depending on who the candidates are, depending on the party. My perspective is we don't owe them anything. We don't have to play their game. Your vote is yours. And if nobody in the two major parties convinces you, I think you're welcome to look elsewhere. I'm very curious as to whether Americans might this time round. There's always talk of third-party candidates. They never really get traction. But this is a really unique set of circumstances where we're being asked to replay the most horrible election. Nobody wants to do it again.
Well, I think that's probably what I would do. But I have to say, I don't feel good about it. And unless the polls really turn around, and I'm talking about a third party whom I can conscionably support and has a chance, then I would vote for that person with a clear conscience. But if they don't have a chance, then I think I'm kidding myself and dodging a choice I don't want to make. And I do. I think that's a kind of self-deceit. It's someone's going to be president, right? So even though we don't want to make a choice between these two men, from the perspective of right now, one of them is going to be president. So we have to decide which one is worse.
Well, Lionel, we're going to have to be in touch because I think both of us are really quite miserable right now. We can send each other like the worst of all the candidates and then figure out who's the least bad over the course of the year. But I'm pleased you got to spend some time with Americans for Christmas. Thanks for joining Spectator TV. It's a new year, but Rishi Sunak's problems remain largely the same. In the magazine's politics column this week, our political correspondent James Heale writes about the next round of battles for Sunak. To tell us about it, James is on the show now. James, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. You write the political column for this week's magazine, and you say that Rishi Sunak is dealing with some serious January blues. One of the problems being that he has to clear up his messaging to voters.
Yes, and I think that's why we're seeing a bit of a reset right now in terms of how they're communicating with the public. Today, on Thursday, Rishi Sunak is going to be doing this town hall to voters in the East Midlands, and it's going to be behind closed doors, which means that you have regional journalists there but not national journalists. I think this is a big shift because previously there have been lots of sort of speeches. You remember the Net Zero speech, obviously the conference speech, and I think that really we're talking to Tory MPs over Christmas. There was a sense of what is going to be our narrative, what is going to be the thing we campaign on. You think 2010 they had change, 2015 it was the long-term economic plan, 2017, 2019 it was Brexit to various extent. And I think this time it's like, what is the big theme? And that's why we're seeing right now, I think, Number 10 opting for these kind of closed-door events and things like Facebook advertising spending, rather than what Keir Starmer's doing today, which is a big speech, national press, etc., in the West Country. So I think that's going to be one to look out for ahead as the Tories try and work out when the election's going to be and what message they're going to run on.
And it's not just the messaging he has to clear up with his potential voters, it's also with his own MPs. And you note in the piece that the Rwanda bill is coming back. And that's going to be a difficult moment for the Prime Minister because the divide within the party right now is some MPs want to soften that bill, others think that it needs to be tightened. They just about managed to keep everybody in line on the other side for Christmas. But at some point you're going to have to make clear to one of those sides, well, we're going in the other direction, aren't you?
Well, that seems to be what the MPs themselves are thinking, and I think there are some on the Tory left who've indicated they won't vote for it. Of course, that means they could just abstain simply, and the government does have a 60-seat majority. And I do think a lot of pressure is going to come from the right, and a couple of issues they're really focusing on, one of which is under this bill, the right for individual migrants to appeal their claim, and the other is about the injunction orders and the discretion role of ministers to block those orders, and they want that to be, they were concerned that the minister is going to be in charge of that. It's the Attorney General. Right now it's Victoria Prentice, someone seen as being on the sort of Tory left, and they're concerned, much the Conservative right is concerned that actually that means they wouldn't use those powers to the full. And so it's one of those things where they said, oh, don't worry, we'll have ministerial discretion, but actually it's one of those things in politics we're never done. So I think there's going to be a big pressure when that comes back. We're expecting that, I think, the third week of January, and then there's going to be the committee stage and I think amendments put down. So those two issues will be something of amendments. And I think the other thing to look out for is whether we'll have outright withdrawal from the ECHR. And the key question is, Kate, is that for a lot of Tory MPs, they're thinking, well, a lot of the delivery stage has been done with this government. There's not so much you can do that's going to be felt on the ground by an election, say, in October, let alone May. So the Rwanda bill is kind of really seen as totemic. And so I think it could be one of those things, just like in 1997, when the Tory line was on an easy compromise between Ken Clarke and John Major on the question of the Euro membership. Actually, a Tory MPs coming up on the backbenches and just in that campaign saying, well, this may be the official line, but my view is I will never join the Euro. And that obviously caused a huge problem around message discipline, etc. And the same is true of this time, which is that you could see, very likely, I think, Rishi Sunak, for instance, in an election say, well, I'm going to do X, Y, Z on injunction orders. And then you could see certain members of, say, for instance, the New Conservatives stand up and say, well, I'm actually going to pull out the ECHR. And of course that then leads into these questions of Tory splits, divides, etc. at a time when CCHQ would love to push the message that Labour's the real divided party. And so I think that's going to be something that plays out throughout the year.
James, there are a lot of questions about whether or not the Rwanda bill can get through Parliament, not least because if Rishi Sunak tightens this bill to the right's liking, the Rwandan government has suggested they might not be comfortable with it if it in any way perceives to break international law. But to keep this domestic for the moment, if the right is happier with this bill because Rishi Sunak has tightened it up in their direction, can it still get through Parliament? You mentioned abstentions there, but could this be a very fragile moment, even a breaking moment for the government?
Yes, there's that real risk of that, and getting it through the Commons is the first stage. And then, of course, you've got the House of Lords to consider as well. Now, talking to people on different sides, I think there's a sense perhaps that the Lords might actually let it through, in that they would consider the bill unlikely to work. So the argument would be, look, we don't want to get into an argument of the peers versus the people. Let's just let the bill fail on its own merits. So I think actually talking to someone on the right, they're just saying, well, look, I mean, why would they necessarily oppose it? Because this bill isn't going to work anyway, and we want to make it work and make it viable. And so a lot of the criticisms come back, and this is the problem for Rishi Sunak in a sense, is that they come back to the arguments made by Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick, who until very recently were serving in charge of his migration and asylum policy. So it's not just necessarily what we saw last year when we had the Windsor Framework vote, and we saw, I think the ERG had been a lot of focus on its strength and numbers, etc., and only got about 25. This is about people who were central to Rishi Sunak's government, central to his Rwanda plan, as of just 2 months ago, now making criticisms which are picked up and run with by others. So it's a big question when it comes down to the amendments. I think a lot of it, frankly, is we're in quite uncharted waters, and whether it will work or not, and how international law will work around these things. I would also just stress that it's not just the UK government that's looking at some of this stuff in terms of the ECHR. It's going to be something across Europe. It's going to be a theme, I think, that's going to dominate for the next decade or so.
And lastly, James, you mentioned that the Labour leader has given a big speech this morning. It's supposed to be sort of an all-encompassing speech about the future. It's very policy light, isn't it? Tell us about what he said.
Well, I thought it was a bit of Groundhog Day watching it today, because he was standing in front of machinery, robotics, etc., and that's exactly the same setting he gave last year for his January speech. So here we are 1 year on, what's changed? And you could say, look at the polls, sometimes you wonder about that. But look, it really, I think it was something for everyone in a sense. Then you look at this in the pre-briefing of the speech. In the speech, there was something for everyone. So, for instance, he was talking about we can't just have politics dressed up as virtue. That was an attempt, I think, to distance himself from Jeremy Corbyn's era. That's the line that the Telegraph run with. There was also talk about cleaning up politics. That's the line that the Guardian run with. And I think really, as you say, it was more about emphasising priorities and focus rather than getting to a big policy-heavy agenda. There are certain merits to that. I think one of the criticisms of, say, for instance, Corbyn in 2019 was it was a huge non-policy document. We're expecting a manifesto much more narrow next time. And I think what was interesting, though, was the way in which he was rehearsing several themes, talking about the optimism of politics being to change your life. And it was very much reminded me of Margaret Thatcher in the late 70s. Don't just hope for a better life, vote for one. And so I think what really, the mistake some of the, I think, press made was when he talked about Margaret Thatcher in that Sunday Telegraph op-ed not too long ago, was saying he wants to be Margaret Thatcher. Now, I don't think he's going to be privatising stuff left, right and centre. What I do think is that he's trying to learn and ape from the successful habits of successful opposition leaders and really mark that language and take it into government. And so I think the question he's shown is that he can be good at politics and opposition, and the challenge for now will be, can he do that as Prime Minister as well?
How much longer can he get away with not being much clearer about the bigger policies he's going to be asked about? We know about his plans to slap VAT on private school fees. We know about his plans to change non-domiciled tax status, but how much longer can he basically move around and not properly address some of those much bigger tax questions that affect day-to-day people?
Well, the big one, of course, is the 28 billion Green New Deal, and I think we're going to see some movement of that later this month. There's been reports that he's going to have some meetings with Rachel Reeves about that, so I think that'll be the big one to work out. Frankly, though, they've done pretty well so far with that talking about policy. So I reckon that they'll be able to get away with it a bit longer. I mean, I spoke to one Shadow Cabinet member about this not so long ago, and they said, well, the problem is when we announce a policy, the Conservatives either try to trash it or they nick it. So they certainly see no harm in holding some of it back. I do think as we get closer to an election, they're doing these exercises of trying to work out, play devil's advocate, red team. Derry Irvine had a similar role before 97, where he would go and sort of intellectually duff up the shadow ministers and talk about their policies, etc. So they will be stress testing each of those as we get closer to it. I will be interested to see how many of those policies that survive pre-2021, when Starmer was in the first phase of his leadership, will make it into that final manifesto. But I think it will be more slimmed down because they want to basically have as few as potential avenues for the Conservatives to attack them on when it comes into that short general election campaign.
James, thanks for joining me. Was Winston Churchill really a progressive? Sinclair McKay says so in this week's magazine. He says that history trying to cast him as a sexist or imperialist is wide off the mark. He joins me to make his case. Sinclair, it's the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth, and we live in a world where many academics and journalists say that he was racist, imperialist, sexist. Your argument in this week's magazine is that he was a progressive pioneer. Tell us why.
He was a progressive pioneer because in certain flashes of his long life, he lived for 90 years. So he was born in 1874 and lived right the way through to 1965, the apotheosis of the Rolling Stones. A great deal have changed throughout that time, and a great deal changed with Churchill too. Yes, there are many academics who are interested in appropriating him as a model of the racist, imperialist, genocidal warmonger. But actually, there's all sorts of different other sides to Churchill that you see peeking through, like flashes from a diamond all the way through his life.
You mentioned Churchill's views on gender and sexuality. Apparently he said that in a next life he'd like to come back as a woman.
And yes, he was talking to his cousin Claire Sheridan in 1920. This was just 2 years after the end of the First World War. He was very drunk. He was with several friends of his and Claire Sheridan in a sort of artistic retreat in Teddington. And she came back one night to discover Churchill in a very sort of non-binary silk dressing gown with several of his friends, absolutely pie-eyed on champagne. And he said, in the next life I intend to come back as a woman.
You also mentioned in your article that he had a relationship with Jenny Lee, the Labour MP and founder of the Open University, who he got on well with. What do you take or what do you read from that relationship?
Well, there are two different things, actually. One of the interesting things about Churchill's life is he lived at a time when men generally didn't think that women should be in politics to begin with. And in fact, it took him a long time to come around to do the suffragette movement and votes for women. But also on top of that, it was a time when men of his class particularly found it quite difficult to talk to women, to look women directly in the eye, to treat them as equals. Churchill actually had a number of very strong friendships with a number of actually rather brilliant women. Violet Asquith, Jenny Lee being another. Because another aspect of his life was that even though he loathed socialism in his bones, detested communism, he got on terrifically well with his political opponents. Jenny Lee was one of them. She was a firebrand Labour MP who got elected to the House in 1929. She was very young. She was in her 20s. So an extraordinary kind of radical figure to land in the House of Commons, all the way up to Scotland. You would have thought just the mortal enemy of Churchill. So Churchill just made a beeline for her. And she was rather kind of beguiled by the fact that he was willing to engage with her and have kind of the proper kind of debates. And so he would have been regarded by her as a kind of monster. But as their friendship went on through to the 1950s, when she was married to to the man who invented Nye Bevan, the man who invented the health service. Even by the 1950s, she was rather charmed and beguiled by Churchill.
You also mentioned in your piece that he may have been slightly more open-minded on homosexuality than his peers would have been at the time.
Absolutely. I think in that sense, Churchill was a curious, genuine kind of pioneer. One of his best friends, Eddie Marsh, who was a brilliant, not only just a civil servant, but a fantastic kind of art collector, artistic figure. Eddie Marsh was not exactly openly gay, but at the same time didn't exactly disguise it either. And he was one of Churchill's best friends, closest associates for many, many years. Eddie Marsh introduced him to the gay composer Ivor Novello, with whom Churchill also got on terrifically well. He was very great friends with W. Somerset Maugham, the gay novelist. And again, this was at a time when homosexuality was illegal, so none of these figures would have proclaimed kind of out loud their orientation. But at the same time, it would have been fairly apparent to Churchill, who had seen a bit of the world and understood a bit of the world, and it made no difference to him. Others may have shied away from such friendships for fear of scandal, for instance, but Churchill never did.
You do accept in your piece that Churchill had, quote, grim views on race. What was his outlook?
I always slightly wonder about. Yes, he was racist, and people at the time thought he was racist too. It's not controversial to say that, but there's different levels to this. He was quoted as being incredibly rude about the Indian people, for instance. And his own friend, Leo Amory, who went to school with him at Harrow, was horrified by Churchill's views on India. But at the same time, there are layers here. We think of Churchill as a child of empire. He was brought up in its kind of the golden sunsets of empire. He lived its kind of fullest life. So that to him was the way the world worked. It would have been very unusual had it been otherwise. But at the same time, there are other instances in that. I was thinking of the 1919 Amritsar massacre, when General Dyer opened fire on an unarmed crowd. And it was expected of Churchill in 1919 that he would stand up in Parliament and defend General Dyer and his actions, and he didn't. He said that this was frightfulness. This is exactly the kind of thing that empire shouldn't be doing. Empire should not be founded on force, because if it's founded on force, then the entire point of it kind of fails. So in many instances, you find that actually he's the opposite of a genocidal warmonger. He's much more human than that. There is a real living human underneath the layers of caricature of Churchill.
Of course, compared to today's standards, being friends with people or not being as explicitly racist as one might expect in a moment is a very, very low bar.
Yes.
I suppose my question to you is, many people will not accept that Churchill was pioneering progressivism, but they will still recognize him as an important historical figure. Do you think that's fair? Do you think that's right?
Yes, but what you also see with Churchill is many of those who now seek to write entire books about how he was a genocidal warmonger, imperialist, and all the rest of it, are in a sense trying to get control of history, which is what Churchill himself was trying to do, having written so much himself over the years. His own 5-volume account of the Second World War, for instance, but beyond that, he was always very, very piercingly aware of his own part as a landmark of kind of history, even at the time. But it's also important to say it's now said that there's a kind of cult of Churchill, that there is kind of unreasoning kind of worship of Churchill, and actually that was never the case. At any kind of point through his life, there were always those who could bitterly, absolutely opposed him and hated him. He was hated by so many Welsh people, and still is, for his actions at Tonypandy in 1910, the general strike of 1926. The entire Labour movement abominated Churchill. He was seen as a monster to so many of them. But on the other side of that, when many of his opponents came finally into close contact with them, they did see that there were kind of layers of kind of humour and layers of compassion too. There was the story of the Liverpool MP Bessie Braddock, who was a formidable, brilliant left-wing figure in the 1950s. She was implacably opposed to Churchill. There was the famous story where she rounded on Churchill and said, "Winston, you're drunk." And he said, "Madam, you're ugly, but tomorrow I shall be sober." Very ungallant. I'm not entirely sure if actually it's true. She didn't even mention it in her memoirs. But what she did say in her memoirs was that they had various other encounters in the House of Commons, and she couldn't help thinking that actually, all right, yes, he is the greatest living Englishman. He was a monster for 1926 and the general strike, but there are other sides of him.
What sort of conservative would Churchill be today? Where would he fall in the party?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Especially when it comes to social issues or small L liberal values.
Yes, I mean, would he be... It's very difficult to say. Would he now fall more on the Rory Stewart side rather than the Reform Richard Tye side? I think he'd be. He wouldn't be a supporter of Nigel Farage. I don't think that kind of simplistic populism, that bombastic populism, would not be his style at all. And as I say, there are layers of subtlety in Churchill's politics. He was always open to new. He was in many. He reformed prisons, for instance, which is why I mentioned the Rory Stewart possible the type. He was also he introduced a certain sort of trade union reforms early in the sort of the 20th century, which meant that unions could not be sued by employers automatically. So every time you think of Churchill as being an extreme right-winger, you always find a case of him actually not being an extreme right-winger at all. Him understanding that sometimes the economy has to be fixed so that working people who find themselves in distress through no fault of their own have to be helped. In that sense, yes, I would say the more moderate.
Potentially on the left of the party. Very interesting. Sinclair?
Or the party as it stands at the moment, anyway.
Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And finally, our Wikiman columnist Rory Sutherland says in this week's magazine that the office has a new overlord. Rory is on the show now. Rory, thank you for joining Spectator TV. You write for this week's magazine about the worrying rise of the office box ticker. Who are these people and why are you concerned about it?
Well, what particularly concerns me is there always seems to be this strange phenomenon, which is large companies employ huge numbers of people, relatively few of whom seem to be principally engaged in effectively performing the task for which the company has been hired. Instead, there's this ever-growing bureaucracy. I think I quote in my piece that the amount spent on HR salaries since, I think, 2017 has gone from 15 billion to 25 billion a year. And I think it's worth asking what's going on. And I think it comes down to, that old Latin phrase, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. And it's the people who are engaged in effectively quantifying or optimizing the efficiency of the organization never really apply the same scrutiny to themselves. And so that if you're a call center worker, which is, seen as a cost, okay, as far as the business is concerned, I don't think a call center worker is a cost. I think it's part of the value a business creates, but it's defined as a cost by the kind of people in the finance function. Your work is scrutinized and your productivity is obsessed over by tons and tons of people who would regard, 10 minutes making a cup of tea as, wasted time. Meanwhile, the people effectively imposing this scrutiny never seem to actually shrink in their numbers. They seem just continuously to grow. It's almost a branch of corporate oncology, if you like. And they're not really, in fact, their productivity, what's the productivity of your finance department? No one has a clue. Their productivity doesn't seem to be scrutinized. It doesn't seem to be measured. And weirdly, mysteriously, as a proportion of overall headcount, these people never seem to do anything except grow. David Graeber, the late anthropologist, actually wrote a whole piece about this called Bullshit Jobs, in which he theorized that contrary to the usual kind of idealistic explanations of private sector businesses, bullshit jobs can exist for all manner of reasons, one of which I think is, the burden of regulation. Undoubtedly creates more and more of these jobs. The fact that you send more and more people to university who are somehow prepared to do a desk job, but regard being a plumber as weirdly beneath them, that undoubtedly magnifies the availability of people for these jobs. But also, in some cases, I think they're kind of there as a kind of reputational shoring up mechanism for the senior management, in the case of HR, who fear a scandal or a breach of something more acutely than they care about their customers in the short to medium term. That's one explanation. In the case of finance, you could argue that the growth of things like, the spreadsheet as a technology has effectively created this absurd culture of over-measurement, which has brought with it a large number of people whose job is effectively channeling numbers through spreadsheets from one person to another without any really clear idea other than the just default heuristic that more information is better, more measurement is better, more metrics are better. If you question that assumption, then it's perfectly plausible that huge swathes of people are being created, and if they ultimately looked at their output, it would be effectively negative. Their contribution to the effective running of the company would almost certainly be negative.
You say in your piece that you think that the culture of box ticking is actually part of the productivity crisis that we have here in the UK.
Yes.
Now,
and the culture of measurement, might be,
and
as
a culture of measurement. Now, those who enjoy asking people to fill in the documents, to fill in the spreadsheets, to collect as many numbers as possible might say, well, we're trying to automate, we're trying to simplify, we're trying to make sure all the information is easily accessible and in one place. You're suggesting actually you're creating some needless work a lot of the time. And I think the really interesting thing about your thesis is, are your resources going to the people who actually do what the company's supposed to do, provide the product that the company wants to provide? Or is it going to all of the red tape within the organization that sometimes slows those things down?
Well, put beautifully, I mean, a very eminent academic I know said that when he first joined the history faculty at the University of Cambridge, the entire faculty was run by, as he described it, a middle-aged woman who knew everything. And he said he looks at the faculty now and there are more administrators than there are historians. So those of us in our 50s have seen this trend over our working lives. I think people who've come in recently into office life, or indeed into the public sector, where it's perhaps even more acute, haven't noticed this trend. But anybody in their 50s or above will have seen, since they started work in the 80s and the 90s, that this trend seems kind of inexorable. Are you measuring the right things? Are you optimizing for the right things? And is a kind of culture of what you might call pseudo-efficiency, where you're trying to optimize the parts rather than optimizing the whole, is this actually good? Because, I mean, one of the great lessons of W. Edward Steamings was, if you want to optimize the whole, you have to sub-optimize the parts. And yet what we have is this culture of what you might call pseudo-efficiency that creeps into every single pocket of corporate life or indeed institutional life. And it's always directed at the people doing useful work, not at the bureaucracy itself. And my claim is that this has led to a kind of Sovietization of capitalism.
Well, let me ask you, Rory, my last question to you is, what would your advice to workers who are under the thumb of the box ticking be? How should they rebel against the box tickers?
Well, my claim is that to some extent, the working from home phenomenon is an act of rebellion. Most people in knowledge work aren't unionized. They have no capacity for collective bargaining. But they did discover that after the pandemic, it was quite difficult for an employer to sack everybody simultaneously. And one thing I would argue for, actually, to a large extent, is that campaigning for liberalization of working hours and practices and locations is a sensible win-win if you look at it in the right mindset. Okay, maybe people are 3% less productive if they work from home, as one statistic showed. Okay, well, in which case, just ask them to work half an hour longer every day. Okay, the whole point of capitalism is it's not actually a process of efficiency optimization; it's a process of discovery. It should be pursued in a way much closer to detective work, an investigation, than as it has become a kind of process of, basically cost cutting dressed up in fancy language. And, as a perfectly enthusiastic capitalist, I see the discovery of new forms of value exchange, if employees actually value flexibility and autonomy more than they value money, okay, that should be an opportunity, in fact, to generate new value, that you can reward people. And apart from anything else, okay, I think London, without some sort of Georgist escape from the stranglehold of London property prices, I think a lot of these London knowledge businesses are effectively destroying the lives of their young people. If I look at our young staff, after we pay them, every incremental pound we pay them, 40% will go in tax. Of what's left over, about 50% will go in accommodation and transport costs, commuting costs and accommodation. That's an appallingly inefficient way to reward people, because you're really rewarding London's buy-to-let landlords with every pound you give them as much as you're rewarding them. And I don't think we're shrewd enough in spotting in looking at efficiency in a broad enough context. What efficiency means in rewarding people is you reward people and a large amount of that money goes to them. And we've created a stupid world where we demand recent graduates live in the most expensive real estate on the planet. And effectively, the capacity to actually enrich people has more or less gone. But it's not helped by the fact that no financially driven organization will ever sit down and go, what are the reasons for paying some of our staff more?
It's also not helped by politicians either, who set a lot of that red tape. Rory, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.